Current LED lights are pretty good. They're actually quite powerful. The batteries last quite a long time, and in general they can be quite light. In the past this was not always the case. In the 1980s, when I started cycling, we used lights with incandescent bulbs. Quite common brands were Ever-Ready and Wonder lights. We thought they were called Wonder lights because you wondered whether you were going to crash into something. Yes, the beam was that bad. To counter these problems, in the early 1990s, I started making my own lights. Again, these used incandescent bulbs. However, I used a more powerful bulb, and I tended to use big batteries. And when I say big, I mean big. They were lead acid batteries, and they weighed about 1.5 kilos. It gave good light, but it was very heavy, very cumbersome, and took a long time to charge. In the early noughties, more powerful LEDs became available, and I started to experiment. In this box are some of my experiments. I put these in the box probably 10 years ago, and I've hardly opened it since. I have been avoiding riding in the dark throughout the winter. The weather's getting better now, and the evenings are lightening up, so I'll be going for some evening rides. However, it still gets dark relatively early, so I will need some lights. Now, I could use these, and maybe I will, but it got me to thinking about these lights that I experimented with all those years ago, so I thought I'd have a look. I'm going to open this up now, and we'll take a look at these together. Remember, this is about the first time I've looked in here for probably at least 10 years. So let's have a look inside, and we just have a box full of what looks like a load of junk. What I'll do is I'll take some of the parts out, I'll go through what I built, why I built them, and how well they did or didn't work. Now, this was in several stages, so I'll start off with the early prototypes and tell you about those, and then work up to the later prototypes. Now, this is part of one of my early prototypes. The LED module is here. This is the white bit, and I made it out of a water pipe fitting, although I purchased an LED module and lens unit, plus a circuit board in here that regulates the current and stops the LED bulb blowing if I put in too much voltage. As you can see, I've got a wire on here with a plug, and I plug this into a battery pack. I'll talk about the battery pack in a minute. I put this together with this couple of brackets. As you can see, there are 2 stations here, and I actually run 2 of these in parallel. That's partly because these LED units were not quite powerful enough. Later on, I added this GoPro mount, so that wasn't part of the original setup. But let's move on and look at the battery pack, so how these were powered. So this is a typical battery pack. I did make several sorts. Here's a much larger double pack. Yeah, I also made up some like this, which take 4 cells as well. And there was a smaller pack that took AAA cells. I built this little pack, and we could put the battery pack in there. In fact, I could fit 2 battery packs in this one, and that would hang over the top tube and then be plugged in. So that's how the battery packs worked, and I tended to use rechargeable cells, although I could use non-rechargeable cells as well if I want to. And I'll use those now to see whether this works. If I open this up and put these cells in, these are just ordinary alkaline cells. Right, so now I haven't plugged this in for quite a few years, so I'm going to plug it in now and see whether it still works. And yes, it does. There's a bit of light coming out of there. If I compare that to the light from a modern bike light, you can see it's completely overwhelmed. That's one reason I used two of these. In fact, I used two different versions of this. One had a slightly higher current driver in it, so the LED would actually be a bit brighter. So I'd have one duller one and one brighter one. There were also some slight differences in that I changed the position of the LED relative to the lens on one of them. That was a more powerful one, and that was so I could make more of a spotlight. The one here, which was a wide angle lens, and the other one would be more of a spotlight. So the two worked in combination with each other. Anyway, that was the first early prototype. Although by modern standards this isn't very bright, at the time it actually wasn't too bad. This was the next prototype, and yes, this is a carbon fibre tube. In fact, I labelled it as the world's first carbon fibre LED bicycle light. Again, it's got the same module in here, and again I made one of these with a wide angle lens and one with more of a spotlight. The first prototype didn't have any switch on it. However, on this one, I have put a switch in there so I can turn it on and off at the light. Let's see whether it works. Yes, it does. Again, it's quite a modest light output. Again, I used it in here, two of them in combination, in order to have one wide angle and one spotlight. So that was the second prototype. After a while, I started to get a bit frustrated with these battery packs. I really wanted to go to a rechargeable system. So my next iteration, I made this. These are a couple of lithium-ion cells in here. I think they're 3.6 volts each, and there are two, so it's about 7 volts. And again, it powers this sort of similar light. And I've made it a bit more waterproof by putting this waterproof plug on there, making the battery pack waterproof by wrapping it in heat shrink, and I made this a little more waterproof too. Unfortunately, I can't test this out because this battery hasn't been charged for about 15 years and I don't even know if it still works. Maybe I'll try charging it and see whether it does work. The light in here was actually much more powerful than this one, about twice the current. I think these were 250 milliamps, whereas this was 500 milliamps. So about twice the power, maybe about twice the lumens coming out of it. And again, I tended to run two of these. That gave me a much better light than I was expecting, and the runtime on this was around about 5 or 6 hours. So it gave quite a good light for quite a good time. Now the cost of this unit, I think it gone up to around about £15, including the batteries. I was buying all of these parts from a Chinese website. No, it wasn't AliExpress, and I can't remember the name of it now. But they were quite reliable and they delivered what they said they would. Because my lights here were actually probably better than most of the lights on the market at the time. This was in probably about 2003, and indeed I passed many of these lights on to friends, and there was one in particular which I made a high power light, a high power spotlight, that I gave to somebody called Digby. And if you're out there at the moment, Digby, do you still have that light? And he used it on the top of his helmet in order to light the path while he was mountain biking. At the time, commercial LED lights were around about £60 to £100, and I thought about making some commercial lights, but I wanted to keep the cost down. And this were the next set of prototypes, and these were primarily produced in order to see whether I could reduce the cost down to an acceptable level. As you can see, they have clamps here for the handlebars, just an ordinary round handlebar. They again had an LED light module with a glass front, and they were inserted into this piece of waste pipe. And I made a blanking plate at the rear with an on-off switch and obviously a electrical input. Again, I haven't tried these for many years, so I'm going to see whether they still work. I was using the same sort of battery pack. It works. Now, these were a bit more of a spotlight, not that powerful, but at the time they were not that bad. In fact, they were actually fairly good, but a modern day light just completely blows it out of the water. And that's one reason why I made these in a pair. Now, I think, again, I made one of these slightly more powerful. Potentially, these could be manufactured for around about £20. However, it took me quite a while to produce these, and in the meantime, commercial lights were getting better and better, and cheaper and cheaper. And eventually, these really just became uncompetitive compared to commercial lights. So, as a commercial project, I abandoned them. I did carry on using them for a few years, though, probably through to around about 2010. Which is when I started using other lights, more commercial lights, and then these went in that box that you saw earlier. So that's sort of a summary of my LED lighting experiments. These days, you can just go out and buy one of these for about £10 or £15, and extremely powerful, extremely bright, last well, and are very reliable. So building your own is not really necessary. However, I did enjoy making these, and I passed a few of them on to some of my cycling companions. Anyway, that was a quick overview of how I experimented with LED lights in the early days of, well, LED lights. I hope you found this interesting, and hopefully, well, it's probably not useful, but if you did find it interesting, please give it a like, maybe a thumbs up, and if you want to see more crap like this, consider subscribing. From me, until the next video, it's goodbye.